What would you do if the one man who swore to protect you became the one man you needed protecting from, and the only proof of his crimes was a child growing inside you? The sound of a hand striking skin does not belong in a parlor lined with gold trim and velvet drapes, and yet it happened there, on a Tuesday afternoon, in front of 6 witnesses who would spend the rest of their lives pretending they had not heard it. Duke Edmund Ashworth stood over his wife with his hand still raised, his knuckles white, his breath coming fast through his nose. Duchess Margaret Ashworth was on the floor of her own parlor, one arm thrown across her belly, the other braced against the carpet to keep herself from falling further. She was 7 months into carrying his child. She did not cry out. She had learned, in the 11 months of this marriage, that crying out only made him angrier. Behind him, half hidden in the shadow of a curtain, Lady Cordelia Winslow lowered her hand from her mouth just far enough to let a small, satisfied breath escape. Nobody noticed. Everybody was watching the Duke, and the Duke was watching his wife, and his wife was looking past all of them at the open trunk in the corner of the room, gold coins spilling across torn ledger pages, and beside it, a man named Silas Foster, bruised and silent, who had tried to warn her 3 days too late. Margaret pressed her palm flatter against her belly and thought only one thing, clear and cold beneath the pain. He has just made his last mistake. If you're just joining us, hit subscribe so you don't miss where this story goes, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I would love to say hello to you personally. Now let's go back to where it all started 12 hours before that ambulance ever left the station. Ravensmoor Hall sat on 400 acres of Yorkshire hillside, and from the road it looked like the sort of house that promised safety. Grey stone walls, tall windows, ivy climbing toward chimneys that never seemed to stop smoking. Margaret Colton had believed that promise once. She had been 19 when Edmund Ashworth first called on her family's modest home in the village, 20 when he proposed in the rose garden behind the church, and 21 now, carrying his child, learning that a house can be beautiful and still be a place where a woman disappears. She had not disappeared all at once. It happened in small pieces. First it was the dinner she was no longer invited to attend when Edmund entertained his business associates. Then it was the accounts, which she had once helped her own father manage as a girl, now locked away in a study she was told not to enter. Then it was Edmund himself, who used to sit beside her in the evenings and ask about her day, who now came home smelling of brandy and another woman's perfume and said nothing at all. On the morning she first felt the child move, she went looking for Edmund to tell him, certain that whatever coldness had grown between them, this at least would soften it. She found him in the stable yard, deep in conversation with Lady Winslow, who had arrived unannounced, as she often did by then, and who laughed at something Edmund said with an ease that Margaret herself had not managed to draw from him in months. She stood at the edge of the yard for a moment, one hand pressed to her belly, the news she had come to share suddenly feeling too fragile to offer into that particular silence, and she turned back toward the house without either of them noticing she had been there at all. She told Mrs. Pruitt instead, later that same day, and found in the old maid's genuine delight something closer to the response she had originally hoped for. It was a small thing, in the scale of everything Ravensmoor Hall would eventually take from her, but Margaret remembered it clearly months later as the moment she understood, without yet having words for it, that the family she could rely upon in that house might not be the one she had married into at all. Margaret walked the East Gallery most mornings before the household woke, one hand resting on the wall for balance, the other resting on the swell of her belly. She talked to the child the way her own mother used to talk to seedlings in the garden, as though speech alone could coax something fragile into growing strong. "Your father was kind once," she said quietly to the empty hallway, to the portrait of Edmund's late mother watching from her gilded frame. "I need you to believe me on that, even if you never see it for yourself." She did not know, yet, how much she would come to regret those words. There had been a version of Edmund once that made those words easy to say. She remembered him at the church fete 2 years earlier, before the title had settled fully onto his shoulders, laughing at something her father said and meaning it. She remembered the letter he had sent her family after their first meeting, careful and a little shy, nothing at all like the man who now moved through Ravensmoor Hall as though every room in it owed him something. Margaret had spent enough quiet mornings turning the question over that she no longer expected to find an answer to it, whether the coldness had always lived in him, waiting for a title and a fortune to give it room to grow, or whether something in this house itself had reached into her husband and hollowed him out 1 week at a time. Either way, the man walking these halls now was not the one who had proposed to her in a rose garden, and Margaret had stopped pretending, at least to herself, that grief alone would bring him back. Mrs. Pruitt found her there most mornings, having served the Ashworth family since before Edmund was born, and it was Mrs. Pruitt who first noticed a change in the house's rhythm. The new woman who had begun calling with increasing frequency, always announced as a family friend, always staying long past the hour friendship required. "Your Grace," Mrs. Pruitt said one morning, setting down a tray of tea with hands that trembled slightly more than they used to. "You ought to eat more than toast. The babe needs your strength." "I have little appetite these days, Mrs. Pruitt." "No," the older woman agreed, glancing toward the study door, behind which low voices could be heard, Edmund's, and a woman's, and laughter that did not belong to Margaret. "I don't suppose you would." Margaret said nothing. She had learned, in this house, that silence was often safer than truth, and she pressed her hand once more against her belly and told herself that whatever else this house had taken from her, it had not yet taken this small, stubborn heartbeat that was entirely, only, hers. That afternoon she took her usual seat in the small library, where the light fell warm through tall windows and the household rarely disturbed her, and she found herself doing what she had increasingly taken to doing in idle hours, reading. Not novels, though she had once loved them, but the estate correspondence Edmund no longer thought to guard from a wife he had stopped consulting. Rent receipts. Merchant invoices. Nothing improper in a woman glancing at papers left open on a side table, she told herself, and yet something about the numbers nagged at her in a way she could not immediately name. She had been raised by a father who kept his own books and had taught his daughter to read a ledger the way other fathers taught daughters to embroider, and what she noticed, turning one page and then another, was a rhythm to the entries that did not match the rhythm of a harvest year. Withdrawals too large, too frequent, clustered around dates she recognized, dates Lady Winslow had called at the house. She said nothing of it to anyone that day. She only remembered it, filed it away the way she had learned to file away everything in Ravensmoor Hall that did not yet have an explanation, and went on with the quiet, watchful patience of a woman who had begun, without quite admitting it to herself, to prepare for a fight. Lady Cordelia Winslow had arrived in Yorkshire 8 months earlier under the story of a widow seeking quiet country air after the death of a husband nobody in the county had ever met. She was beautiful in the particular way that made men stop listening the moment she started speaking, and she used that beauty the way a soldier uses a weapon, carefully, deliberately, and always with a target in mind. Her target was Ravensmoor Hall, though Edmund Ashworth believed, with the full confidence of someone who had never once questioned his own judgment, that her target was him. "You look troubled, Edmund," she said one evening, seated across from him in the study with a glass of sherry she barely touched. "Is it the accounts again? Foster tells me the harvest income is down 1/3 from last year. I don't understand it. The tenants paid their rents in full." "Perhaps," Cordelia said gently, "your accountant is not as honest as you believe. Foster has served this family for 20 years. "And your wife's family," Cordelia said, letting the words fall as though they cost her something to say, "has served no one but themselves. Forgive me. I only worry for you. I have heard whispers of servants' talk, nothing more that Margaret has been seen with the estate's ledgers herself, in hours when you are not at home." This was a lie built on a single truth. Margaret had asked Foster, once, about a discrepancy in the tenant accounts, out of nothing more than the habit of a woman raised to understand numbers. Cordelia had turned that single conversation into a thread, and she pulled it now, slowly, watching it tighten around Edmund's trust in his own wife. "She would not," Edmund said, but the certainty in his voice had already begun to crack. "Of course not," Cordelia agreed, and reached across to touch his hand, letting her fingers linger a moment longer than friendship required. "I only tell you because I care what becomes of you, Edmund. A man in your position cannot afford blind spots. Not with so much at stake." What Cordelia did not say, what she had told no one in Yorkshire, and what only a man named Lord Pembroke, 3 counties away, knew for certain, was that she had been paid a considerable sum to see Ravensmoor Hall stripped of its wealth and its standing, its land titles made available to a syndicate of foreign investors who had been circling English estates weakened by debt and scandal for the better part of 2 years. Edmund's pride was not an obstacle to that plan. It was the tool she intended to use to carry it out. Her work did not stop at the study door. In the village below Ravensmoor Hall, where Margaret had once been a well-liked daughter of a respected family, a different kind of rumor began circulating that autumn carried by a shopkeeper's wife who had heard it from a maid who had heard it from someone in Lady Winslow's confidence, each retelling adding a little more certainty to a story that had begun as nothing more than careful suggestion. The Duchess was cold to her own husband. The Duchess kept strange company. The Duchess, some said behind gloved hands at the market stalls, might not even be carrying the child everyone assumed she was. Margaret felt the shift before she understood its source. A curtsy held a beat too long, a greeting exchanged with eyes that did not quite meet hers, a silence that followed her into shops where she had once been welcomed warmly. She said nothing of it to Edmund, certain by then that anything she reported would be turned, in Cordelia's careful hands, into further proof of the very deception she was being accused of. She only noted it, the way she noted everything now, and continued walking through a village that no longer quite knew what to make of her, with her chin level and her hand steady on the curve of her belly, refusing to give anyone watching the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She smiled at him now, soft and patient, and watched him carry her poison back into his marriage without ever once suspecting the hand that had poured it. Below stairs, Cordelia's influence spread by a different, quieter method. She was generous with the servants in small, visible ways. A coin pressed into a footman's hand, a kind word for the scullery girls, a gift of ribbon for Margaret's own lady's maid, who left the household not long after under circumstances no one below stairs cared to discuss aloud. What replaced her was a girl named Susan who watched Margaret with a curiosity that felt, more than once, like reporting rather than service, and Margaret learned within a fortnight to say nothing in Susan's hearing that she was not prepared to have repeated in the study behind Edmund's closed door. Mrs. Pruitt saw it too, and said as much one evening while brushing out Margaret's hair with the same care she had once given Edmund's mother. "She is building herself a house within a house, Your Grace. A little army of small kindnesses, and every one of them a debt she means to collect later. You think I imagine the danger, Mrs. Pruitt? I think you see it more clearly than most, Your Grace. I only worry you are alone in the sea." Margaret said nothing to that, because there was no comfortable answer to give, and because some nights, alone in her chambers with her hand resting against the small movements of the child inside her, she allowed herself to feel exactly as alone as Mrs. Pruitt had named it. She did not allow herself to feel it for long. There was no room left in her, she had decided, for fear that did not also teach her something useful. Silas Foster had managed the Ashworth account since Edmund was a boy learning his letters, and in 20 years he had never once found the books in the disorder he found them in that autumn. Rents recorded as paid that had never arrived. Withdrawals authorized in Edmund's hand for sums the Duke could not seem to explain when Foster gently asked. A pattern, once Foster laid the pages side by side on his study desk, that pointed not toward carelessness but toward a hand deliberately bleeding the estate dry. He brought his findings to Margaret first, not Edmund, because in the last month Edmund had stopped receiving him with anything but irritation, and because Foster had begun to suspect, though he did not yet have proof, that whoever was draining Ravensmoor's coffers had already found a way into the Duke's ear. "Your Grace," Foster said, meeting Margaret in the small library where she took her afternoon tea alone, "I would not trouble you with this if I believed there was anyone else who would listen." He spread 3 ledger pages across the table. Margaret studied them with the quiet focus her father had taught her, tracing sums with one finger, and within a few minutes her face had gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with the child she carried. "These withdrawals," she said. "They match the dates Lady Winslow has called on the house." "I noticed the same, Your Grace. I did not want to believe it meant what it appears to mean." "Does my husband know you've come to me?" "No, Your Grace. And I confess I am afraid of what will happen if he learns of it before we have proof enough to show him plainly." Margaret spent that night comparing Foster's pages against the fragments she had already noticed on her own, and by the small hours of the morning she understood the shape of what was happening to her husband's estate, even if she did not yet understand who stood behind it. She thought, briefly and without real hope, of bringing the pages to Edmund herself, of laying them across his desk and asking him plainly to look. She decided against it before the thought had fully finished forming. The last 3 times she had tried to raise a concern about the household accounts, Edmund had told her, with increasing coldness, that such matters were not a wife's burden to carry. She did not believe, any longer, that he would hear her differently now. He was right to be afraid, though neither of them yet knew how quickly that fear would be tested. In the 2 days before the confrontation, Margaret found herself watching Edmund with a new, deliberate attention, cataloguing every small change in him the way Foster had taught her to catalogue discrepancies in a ledger. He was short with the staff in a way he had not been a year earlier. He avoided her eyes at dinner. He spent long hours with Cordelia and returned from those hours quieter, more brittle, as though something in him were being worn steadily thinner by whatever was said behind that study door. She considered, more than once, simply asking him outright what troubled him, laying aside pride on both their parts for the sake of whatever remained of their marriage. She decided against it each time, not out of fear exactly, but out of a clear-eyed recognition that a man already primed to distrust her would hear any question she asked as further proof of guilt. It was, she thought later, the last calm decision she made before everything in that house changed the choice to wait, to watch, to gather what proof she could rather than hand her husband more reason to believe the worst of her. She would spend a long while afterward wondering whether a different choice might have spared her the blow that followed. She never found a version of that week where the answer felt certain. 2 days later, Cordelia found the ledger pages missing from Foster's study moved, she assumed correctly, into Margaret's keeping, and she went to Edmund not with suspicion but with certainty dressed up as sorrow. "I did not want to be the one to tell you this," she said, her voice trembling with practiced grief. "But I saw your accountant leaving your wife's chambers 2 nights past, carrying papers he tried to hide beneath his coat. Edmund, I fear they are conspiring against you. I fear she means to claim the child is not." She let the sentence die unfinished, which was crueler than finishing it, because it let Edmund's own mind supply the worst possible ending. He found Margaret in the parlour an hour later, surrounded by the household staff who had gathered for the reading of the week's correspondence, Foster among them, still bruised from a confrontation with Edmund Stewart that morning that had left him slumped near the family's strongbox with torn pages scattered at his feet. "You have been meeting with him in secret," Edmund said, and his voice carried the particular calm of someone who has already decided what he believes and is only waiting for an excuse to act on it. "Edmund, I can explain the ledgers." "The child," he said, and something in his face had gone past anger into a place with no reason left in it at all. "Is it even mine?" The room went silent. Mrs. Pruitt's hand flew to her chest. Colonel Harris, seated near the window, went rigid but did not move. And Margaret, 7 months pregnant, rose from her chair with as much dignity as her body allowed and said the only thing she had left to say. "You know it is." He struck her before the last word had finished leaving her mouth. She went down hard, one arm thrown instinctively across her belly, and in the silence that followed, broken only by Mrs. Pruitt's stifled cry, Cordelia Winslow lowered her hand from her mouth and let herself, for one unguarded second, smile. No one moved for what felt to Margaret like a very long time, though she would later be told it was only a few seconds. Whitfield's jaw had gone tight enough to whiten. Colonel Harris had risen halfway from his chair before catching himself and going still again, his hand curled into a fist at his side that he did not raise. It was Mrs. Pruitt who reached her first, kneeling on the parlour floor without any regard for her own aching knees, one arm around Margaret's shoulders, murmuring something wordless and steady the way she might have soothed the child. Margaret did not cry. She was aware, distantly, of a ringing in her ear and a warmth blooming along her cheek, and beneath both of those there was a far more urgent question her body was already answering for her, a small, insistent movement beneath her ribs that told her, as clearly as any doctor could have, that the child had not been harmed. She held on to that fact the way a drowning woman holds onto driftwood, and let Mrs. Pruitt help her to her feet, and did not once look at her husband on her way out of the room, because she had already decided, somewhere in the silence after the blow, that she had nothing left to say to him that he deserved to hear. Edmund did not apologize. Men like him rarely did, because apology required admitting there had been something to apologize for, and in the days that followed he told himself instead that his wife had provoked him, that grief over a fortune he believed was being stolen from him had simply overtaken his good sense, that whatever had happened in that parlour was, in some fashion he never fully examined, her fault rather than his own. Margaret was moved to the west wing of Ravensmoor Hall the following morning, colder rooms, farther from the family's daily life, close enough to a servant's stare that the arrangement could not be mistaken for anything but banishment. She did not argue. Arguing, she had learned, only invited more of what she had already survived, and there was a child inside her now who needed her calm far more than he needed her pride. She sat by the window most days, watching the ground she had once loved to walk, and she let her mind do the work her body could no longer safely attempt. If Edmund believed her capable of conspiracy, then Edmund had made a mistake, because a woman accused of something she has not yet done has very little left to lose in actually doing it. "You mustn't give up hope, Your Grace," Mrs. Pruitt said, arriving each evening with a tray of food and, more importantly, with news who had called at the house, what had been said below stairs, where Lady Winslow had been seen and for how long. "There are those of us who remember what this house was before she came into it." "I am grateful, Mrs. Pruitt. More than I can say." "You needn't say it. Only get well, and get strong, and let the rest of us worry over the particulars." Mr. Foster, recovering in the gatekeeper's cottage from injuries he would not fully explain, sent word through Mrs. Pruitt that he had managed to copy the most damning of the ledger pages before Cordelia's people could destroy the originals, and that he had hidden the copies somewhere even Edmund Stewart would not think to search. It was not proof of everything, not yet, but it was a beginning, and Margaret, sitting alone in a cold room with her hand pressed to the curve of her belly, understood that a beginning was more than she had held an hour before. "We will not stay hidden forever," she told the child, her voice low and steady. "I promise you that." The days in the West Wing settled into a pattern that Margaret came, in time, to find almost restfulness, in the way that silence after a storm can feel restful even when the wreckage is still being counted. She woke early, before the household stirred, and lay for a while feeling the child move small ripples beneath her palm that had become, in the absence of any other comfort in that house, the closest thing she had to conversation. She read what books Mrs. Pruitt could smuggle up from the library. She practiced, in her own mind, the account she would one day give of everything that had happened to her, sharpening it the way her father had once taught her to sharpen an argument before bringing it to a magistrate. Edmund sent no word. Twice she heard his footsteps pause outside her door, longer than a passing man's footsteps ought to pause, and twice she heard them move on again without a knock. She told herself she did not care what kept him from knocking, and told herself this often enough that some days she nearly believed it. It was Whitfield, of all people, who broke the pattern first. He came to the west wing under the pretense of inspecting a leak in the roof, and once the door was closed behind him, he set down his tools and spoke in a voice pitched carefully low. "I have served this family since before the old Duke passed, Your Grace, and I will not pretend I have always agreed with how it has been run since. But I know the difference between a wife who schemes against her husband and one who has been made a convenient villain by someone with better manners and worse intentions. I thought you ought to know you are not as friendless in this house as it may appear." "Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. I confess I did not expect to hear that from you." "Nor did I expect to say it," he admitted, gathering his tools again. "But there is a limit to what a man can watch happen under his own roof and still call himself honorable for saying nothing." He left without waiting for a reply, and Margaret sat for a long while afterward with her hand pressed to her belly, feeling something that was not quite hope but stood close enough beside it to be worth holding on to. The physician came twice a week to check on her condition, a quiet man named Dr. Hale who had delivered half the county and had learned, over many years of practice, to keep his opinions about a household's private troubles strictly to himself. He examined her gently, listened to the child's heartbeat with obvious relief each time, and on his third visit to the west wing he paused at the door and said the only thing that came close to acknowledging what he must have noticed about her bruised cheek and her cold, isolated rooms. "You are stronger than most women I attend, Your Grace, and the child is strong besides. Whatever else is happening in this house, that much I can promise you plainly." It was not much, as comfort went, but Margaret held on to it the way she had learned to hold on to every small kindness that came her way that season, turning it over in quiet moments the way another woman might turn over a keepsake, until even the smallest scrap of goodness became something solid enough to build a little more courage upon. What Edmund never understood about his own household was that loyalty, once spent carelessly, does not simply vanish. It moves. It finds a new place to live. And in the weeks following the parlour, loyalty at Ravensmoor Hall migrated almost entirely from the Duke's study to the cold rooms of the West Wing, carried there in small, quiet acts that no single person could have been punished for alone. Mr. Whitfield, the estate steward who had said nothing for 20 years out of habit rather than agreement, began leaving copies of household correspondence where Mrs. Pruitt could find them and carry them upstairs. Colonel Harris, whose stillness in that parlour had looked to everyone like indifference, revealed himself to Margaret one evening to be something else entirely, a crown-appointed observer who had been quietly investigating irregularities in noble estates suspected of foreign financial interference, sent to Ravensmoor months earlier under the guise of an old family friendship. "I could not act until I had proof, Your Grace," he told her, standing at a respectful distance in the West Wing's small sitting room. "I did not anticipate how far your husband's mistress would let this go before I found it. You watched him strike me and said nothing." "I watched, and it cost me more than you know to hold my tongue. But a premature accusation would have given Lady Winslow time to disappear, and everything Mr. Foster risked his safety to gather would have gone with her. I am sorry, Your Grace. I am here now, and I do not intend to leave until this is finished properly." Margaret studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, because anger at a man trying to help her accomplished nothing, and she had very little strength left to spend on feelings that did not move her forward. There was one night, midway through their investigation, when the work very nearly ended before it was finished. Susan, the lady's maid Cordelia had placed close to Margaret's household months earlier, reported to the study that lamplight had been seen burning late in the West Wing on evenings when it ought not to have been, and Edmund, still nursing a wounded pride that had curdled into suspicion of everyone around him, sent Whitfield to investigate. It was Whitfield's own doing that saved them. He searched the West Wing loudly and thoroughly enough to give Mrs. Pruitt time to hide the ledger pages inside a hollowed hymnal Margaret kept beside her bed, then reported to Edmund that he had found nothing but a duchess reading scripture too late into the night for her own good. "You take a great risk for me, Mr. Whitfield," Margaret said afterward, once the house had gone quiet again. "I take a great risk for this house, Your Grace," he corrected gently. "You simply happen, at present, to be the best hope it has." Together, over the following weeks, they built what Foster's stolen ledger pages had only begun: a full accounting of funds diverted through false tenant payments, forged withdrawal authorizations bearing Edmund's signature in a hand Colonel Harris's contact in London confirmed was not quite his own, and a paper trail that led, patiently and unmistakably, back to correspondence between Cordelia Winslow and a Lord Pembroke whose interest in Ravensmoor's land had nothing to do with friendship. and everything to do with the syndicate prepared to purchase the estate the moment its debts became public. There was one document Colonel Harris kept separate from the rest, retrieved from the Crown Archives at his own request and read to Margaret by candlelight with Mrs. Pruitt standing guard at the door. It is an old decree, Your Grace, older than your husband's title. It states that should a duke of this line publicly renounce his lawful wife and the child she carries by declaration before witnesses, he forfeits his own claim to the dukedom in favor of that child, legitimate by birth, with the mother standing as regent until the child comes of age. Margaret sat very still, one hand resting on her belly, and felt something shift inside her that was not fear. He has not renounced us yet. No, Harris agreed. But Lady Winslow is planning a gala to ensure that he does, publicly, before every family of consequence in the county. She means it to be his triumph, and yours. Then let her have her gala, Margaret said quietly. Only let it end differently than she intends. There was one evening, before the plan had fully taken its final shape, when Foster asked to speak with Margaret alone, and she saw for the first time the full account of what had happened to him the week the ledger pages went missing. He did not dwell on it. He was not a man given to dwelling. But he told her plainly that Edmund Stewart, a man since dismissed from service once Whitfield's true loyalties became clear, had cornered him near the strong-box and made it understood, without ever quite saying so outright, that continued curiosity about the estate's accounts would not be tolerated. I am not a brave man, Your Grace, Foster said, turning his hat over in his hands. I want you to know that plainly, so you do not mistake me for something I am not. I very nearly let the matter drop after that. Why didn't you? Because I have kept this family's books since before you were born to your own family, and I have watched a house I have loved a great deal be quietly hollowed out by people who never once earned the right to touch it. A man can be frightened and still refuse to be complicit, Your Grace. I decided which of those two things mattered more to me. Margaret thought of that conversation often in the weeks that followed, turning it over the way she turned over the ledger pages themselves, and she found in it something she had not expected to find in the middle of so much betrayal, proof that courage did not require the absence of fear, only a decision about what mattered more. Cordelia Winslow had learned patience in a profession that rewarded very little of it, and she spent the final weeks before the gala tightening every thread of the plan she had spun since the first day she stepped inside Ravensmoor Hall. She convinced Edmund that a grand winter gathering would restore his standing in the county, a chance to announce, before witnesses whose opinions he valued more than his own conscience, that his marriage was ending and a new duchess would soon take Margaret's place. You have suffered long enough carrying suspicion of another man's child, she told him, her hand resting against his arm in the study one evening. Let the county see you reclaim your dignity. Edmund, who had spent months rebuilding a version of events in which he was the wrong party rather than the man who had struck his pregnant wife in front of 6 witnesses, found the idea appealing in exactly the way Cordelia intended it to be. What he did not know, what Cordelia herself did not suspect, for all her careful planning, was that the west wing of his own house had spent those same weeks preparing an answer of its own. Margaret, with Mrs. Pruitt's help, had a gown made in deep, unadorned black, chosen not for mourning but for the particular kind of quiet strength that refuses to compete for attention because it does not need to. Mr. Foster, recovered enough to stand and speak clearly, met twice with Crown solicitors Colonel Harris had summoned from London, men who arrived at Ravensmoor under invented business names and left with sworn statements locked in a case Foster did not let out of his sight. Are you certain you wish to attend, Your Grace? Mrs. Pruitt asked on the evening before the gala, fastening the last button at Margaret's collar with careful hands. No one would think less of you for staying away. I would think less of myself, Margaret said, studying her reflection in the glass, the black gown, the belly she no longer tried to hide beneath a shawl, the face that had cried in this house more than she ever intended to admit and had, at last, stopped. He wants an audience for my humiliation, Mrs. Pruitt. I intend to give him one of his own instead. Mrs. Pruitt spent 3 evenings on the black gown alone, unpicking and resetting the waist twice to accommodate the fullness of Margaret's final month, and she worked in near silence, her needle moving with a particular concentration of a woman putting more into a garment than thread. When she finally held it up by candlelight for Margaret's approval, neither of them said very much. There was nothing showy about it, no lace, no ornament beyond a narrow band of jet beading at the collar, and that plainness was exactly the point. Cordelia would arrive at the gala dressed to be admired. Margaret intended to arrive dressed to be believed. It is a fine piece of work, Mrs. Pruitt. It will do what it needs to do, Your Grace. That is all I ask of any gown. Cordelia, in the final days before the gala, allowed herself the small indulgence of confidence. She had built ruins out of stronger houses than this one, and Edmund Ashworth's pride had proven, From the very first evening she measured it to be the easiest kind of foundation to crack. She wrote to Lord Pembroke that week with an assurance she rarely permitted herself in correspondence, promising him that Ravensmoor's debts would be a matter of public record within the month and its land titles available to his syndicate not long after. She did not know that the letter itself, intercepted through channels Colonel Harris had quietly arranged weeks earlier, would become one of the very documents read aloud in that same ballroom before the evening was finished. Confidence, Margaret had come to understand by then, was the one weakness a clever woman like Cordelia could never fully guard against, because it required believing, at least a little, in one's own invincibility, and invincibility, as Ravensmoor Hall was about to prove, belonged to no one in that house at all. Outside, carriages had already begun arriving along the drive, their lamps glowing gold against the dark, carrying half the county toward a night that Edmund Ashworth believed would end in his triumph, and that his wife, 7 months pregnant and finished with fear, intended to end in something else entirely. The ballroom at Ravensmoor Hall had not held a gathering this large since Edmund's own christening. Candlelight caught the gold trim along the ceiling and threw it back in 100 small points of light, and the county's finest families moved through the room in silk and polished boots, exchanging the kind of pleasant, meaningless conversation that filled every gala Margaret had ever attended in this house. She stood near a side door with Mrs. Pruitt close behind her, watching Edmund receive compliments from men who had no idea what he had done to earn his wife's absence from his side, and she felt, beneath the calm she had spent weeks building, a current of something sharper than nerves. Colonel Harris found her there with a small nod that carried more reassurance than any words could have managed. "Foster and the solicitors are in place. Whitfield has seen to the doors. Whenever you are ready, Your Grace." "I have been ready for months, Colonel. I was only waiting for the room to be full enough to matter." By the time the musicians paused for the evening's central announcement, every family of consequence in Yorkshire stood beneath the chandeliers waiting to hear the Duke speak. Edmund rose to the small dais at the room's edge with Cordelia at his side, dressed in deep blue silk that made the room murmur its approval, and he began the speech. She had helped him write a careful account of a marriage undertaken in good faith and betrayed by a wife's deception, a child whose parentage he could no longer, in conscience, claim as his own. "I have carried this burden long enough," he said, his voice carrying clean across the silent room. "Before you all, I renounce." "You will want to finish that sentence carefully, Your Grace." The voice belonged to Colonel Harris, who had crossed the ballroom floor with 4 men in plain dress that nonetheless carry the unmistakable bearing of Crown officers, and behind them, moving slowly but with her chin held level, came Margaret in her black gown, one hand resting on the curve of her belly, the other steady at her side. Edmund's face went white. Cordelia's went whiter still, and it was her reaction, the sudden, involuntary step backward toward the ballroom's edge, that told the watching room something had shifted before a single word of explanation had been offered. "Mr. Foster," Harris said, and Silas Foster stepped forward from the crowd, no longer bruised, no longer blooded, standing straight in a coat Whitfield had helped impress for the occasion. "Tell them what you found." Foster's account took only a few minutes: forged withdrawals, false tenant payments, a trail of correspondence between Lady Cordelia Winslow and a Lord Pembroke whose syndicate had been prepared to purchase Ravensmoor's debts the moment Edmund's ruin became official. Cordelia opened her mouth to deny it and found nothing waiting there but silence, because the solicitors standing beside Harris were already presenting sworn statements and bank records that made denial pointless. "She was never your friend, Edmund," Margaret said, and her voice, quiet as it was, reached every corner of the frozen ballroom. "She was paid to see this house destroyed, and you handed her every tool she needed to do it." "This is not," Edmund began, but Colonel Harris was already unfolding a final document, older and more formal than the others, and reading it aloud for the entire room to hear: the ancient decree, the forfeiture it required of any duke who publicly renounced his lawful wife and unborn child, the regency it granted that same wife until the child came of age. "You have just renounced your wife and your unborn child before every witness this room contains, Your Grace," Harris said, and there was no triumph in his voice, only fact. "By your own words, spoken not a minute ago, the title no longer belongs to you." "This is absurd," Edmund said, but his voice had lost the certainty it carried a moment earlier. "That decree is a relic. No court in England would honor it." "The Crown already has, Your Grace," Harris said, and produced a second document bearing a seal even Edmund recognized. 3 days ago, in anticipation of exactly this evening." Edmund turned to Cordelia, searching her face for some denial he could still believe, and found only a woman already calculating her own escape. "Tell them this is nonsense. Tell them." She said nothing at all, which told him everything he had refused to see for the better part of a year. The silence that followed lasted long enough for Edmund to understand, fully and finally, what he had done. Cordelia was already moving toward the ballroom side doors, her composure gone, her plan collapsing around her, and two of Harris's men followed without needing to be told. She did not make it past the courtyard before they stopped her, and the letter to Lord Pembroke still folded in her reticule would, within the month, become evidence enough to see her syndicate's ambitions in England ended for good, along with a warrant in her own name that ensured Yorkshire would be the last county in England to see her again. Edmund did not follow her. He stood alone at the centre of a room full of people who had, an hour earlier, been prepared to applaud him, and found that not one of them would meet his eyes. Margaret did not gloat. She had imagined this moment more than once in the cold rooms of the West Wing, and in every version she had imagined, she had wanted to feel triumphant. What she felt instead, standing in the ballroom with her hand on her belly and her husband's ruin spread out before 300 witnesses, was something quieter and far more lasting relief, and beneath it, the first clean breath she had taken in almost a year. The room, once its shock had passed, did not turn against her. If anything, the families who had spent a year exchanging cautious rumors about the Duchess's coldness now approached her with a different kind of attention entirely, and Margaret accepted their concern with the same steady grace she had carried into the ballroom, neither warming to it too quickly nor pushing it away. Mrs. Pruitt found her near the terrace doors an hour later, tears standing openly in her eyes for the first time since the parlour. "I have served this family for 20 years, Your Grace, and I have never once been prouder to call this house my home. You built this victory as much as I did, Mrs. Pruitt. Perhaps more." "Nonsense," the old woman said, dabbing at her eyes with the corner of her apron. "I only carried trays and kept my ears open. It was you who had the courage to stand in that room tonight." Whitfield and Foster stood together near the ballroom's edge, both looking, for the first time in longer than either could remember, entirely at ease in the house they served, and Colonel Harris, his official duty at Ravensmoor concluded, offered Margaret a short, formal bow before taking his leave into the cold night, already turning his attention toward whatever inquiry would come next in his quiet service to the Crown. 3 months later, in a nursery repainted in soft yellow at Mrs. Pruitt's insistence, Margaret held her daughter for the first time and understood that everything the ancient decree had promised was already true in a way no document could fully capture. She named her Grace, not for the title that came attached to her cradle, but for the quality Margaret hoped she would carry through a life that had already, by birthright, made her the true heir of Ravensmoor Hall. The estate itself had changed in ways visitors from the county remarked on within weeks. Margaret stood as regent in her own right, and she governed the way her father had once managed his own modest accounts plainly, honestly, with the books open to any tenant who wished to see them. Whitfield managed the estate's daily business with a steadiness the household had not known in years. Foster was restored fully to his position, and it was Foster himself who suggested, and Margaret who approved, that a portion of the recovered funds be set aside each year to support tenant families facing hardship, so that the very fraud that had once bled the estate dry might, in its undoing, leave something useful behind. Edmund had been stripped of his title and his fortune, left with only the small allowance the law required and a county's memory of exactly what he had done to earn it. He wrote to Margaret once, in the spring, asking to see the child. Margaret read the letter twice, considered it honestly rather than out of spite, and answered that Grace would know her own history when she was old enough to understand it fairly, and that an introduction built on his terms rather than the truth would serve no one, least of all her daughter. She did not hear from him again. Cordelia Winslow was never seen in Yorkshire again, though word reached Margaret eventually that Crown investigators had traced her, and Lord Pembroke's syndicate with her, to a reckoning of their own in London, one that owed a considerable debt to a beaten accountant's stolen ledger pages and a steward who had finally decided silence was no longer worth keeping. Margaret looked down at her daughter, asleep now in the soft yellow light, and thought of everything the last year had cost her and everything it had, in the end, given back. A house, she had come to understand, is not made safe by the strength of its walls or the wealth kept inside them, but by the people willing to stand within it and tell the truth even when the truth is dangerous. A maid who kept watch when watching cost her comfort, an accountant who chose honesty over safety, a steward who broke a habit of silence 20 years old, and a woman who refused to let fear decide who she would become. She had learned that lesson the hardest way it could be taught. She intended to make certain her daughter learned it far more gently, and that if the day ever came when Grace needed the same courage her mother had found in a cold West Wing room, she would already know, without having to be told, exactly where to find it. Thank you for staying until the end of Margaret's story. If it moved you, subscribe so you never miss the next one, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going.